Welcome to the deep dive. You sent us your sources, and our mission, as always, is to extract the key nuggets of knowledge and insight.
hmm
Today, we're venturing into the final chapters of two remarkable, though seemingly disparate, lives. Marie Antoinette, the ill-fated Queen of France, and Sultan Abdulhamid II of the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, it might seem like an unusual pairing at first glance.
Yeah,
18th century France and the early 20th century Ottoman world.
right.
However, the historical analyses, biographical excerpts, and accounts of Abdulhamid's exile that you've provided, well, they reveal fascinating parallels
How so?
in how both figures grappled with deposition, the whole experience of exile, and their eventual deaths amidst really significant political upheaval. It makes you think, doesn't it, about the sort of universal experiences of those who lose power.
Absolutely. We're not drawing direct equivalencies here, obviously, but
Yeah.
more exploring the human drama inherent in these situations. What happens when immense power is just stripped away? How do individuals attempt to navigate those final challenging years? Let's start by unpacking the tragic final act of Marie Antoinette's story.
Okay, well, the forced relocation from the grandeur of Versailles to Paris in 1789 was just a seismic shift.
Huge.
Imagine arriving at the Tuileries, a palace in name only, practically devoid of furniture. It's such a powerful symbol of their reduced circumstances, isn't it?
Completely. Stripped bare, much like their authority.
Exactly.
And the journey itself was just brutal, wasn't it? With those grim trophies, the guards' heads.
Oh, yeah. Horrific. And our sources also point to the very ambiguous role of Lafayette's guards. Were they protectors or jailers?
That's the question, isn't it? It seems their primary loyalty was to the revolutionary cause, not really to the royals themselves.
Precisely. One source quotes Lafayette's stark warning to Marie Antoinette. Basically, the revolution's survival trumps the king's.
Wow.
That single statement really reframes the entire dynamic of their supposed security. They were under constant surveillance, their every move dictated by forces, way beyond their control.
And despite the king's growing despair, Marie Antoinette emerges from our sources as the one with a clear grasp of the perilous situation.
Yes, she does.
And here's where it gets really interesting. She initiated what we might call a public relations campaign, deliberately engaging with ordinary Parisians in the Tuileries gardens, soldiers, market women, even children.
It's quite a contrast to the rigid, courtly life she was used to, isn't it?
Totally. This sudden immersion in the lives of the common people after years of gilded isolation, it really underscores the changing times.
It's a striking adaptation, really. A recognition that the old rules of court just didn't apply anymore.
Right.
And this wasn't just about, winning hearts and minds. It was a desperate attempt to forge some kind of connection, to humanize herself and her family in the eyes of a populace that was increasingly hostile.
And this public engagement was paired with political efforts too, right?
Yeah.
Behind the scenes.
Yes, clandestine political efforts, seeking some way to work with the revolutionary leaders, negotiating from a position of imprisonment, though, with the revolution in such flux. I mean, that was an almost impossible task.
You'd think so. So when those efforts inevitably failed, the focus shifted to escape.
Right.
It's remarkable that Marie Antoinette was apparently the driving force behind this plan, and the strategy was quite specific, wasn't it?
It was. They weren't aiming to flee France entirely.
No.
Perhaps understanding that would just solidify their image as traitors. The objective was to reach a royalist stronghold within the country.
Okay. And of course, the enigmatic figure of Count Axel Fersen pops up here.
Yes, Fersen. Our sources acknowledge the persistent rumors and, let's say, romantic interpretations of their relationship.
Always the question.
Always. However, it's crucial to consider the practical realities. As one source points out, introducing a potentially illegitimate heir into that volatile political landscape would have been incredibly risky.
You'd think.
The fact that Louis XVI publicly acknowledged all their children really speaks to the complexities of their situation.
Yeah, absolutely. So the escape attempt itself, the famous flight to Varennes in June 1791, it reads like a dramatic thriller.
It really does.
Disguises, a midnight departure, Marie Antoinette even walking right past Lafayette unknowingly.
Incredible.
It almost seems too easy in the initial stages, doesn't it? You sort of wonder about the level of genuine intent to actually stop them at that point.
It does raise questions, doesn't it? However, the logistical challenges of 18th century travel quickly caught up with them.
Right.
The constant need for fresh horses, the lack of proper planning for supplies, and the ever-present risk of encountering local authorities. It all contributed to their eventual failure.
And Louis VI's decision to station troops along their route. That seems counterintuitive.
Well, it was intended for protection, but ironically, it just drew more attention to their movements.
Yeah. Yet we also learn that some royalists recognized them but chose to remain silent.
Which highlights the divided loyalties and just the pervasive fear of the era, really.
So the pivotal moment was their arrival in Varennes.
Yes, a small town that wasn't even equipped as a proper postal relay station. Their private transport wasn't there.
Oh, no.
And you have this almost unbelievable image of the King and Queen of France going door to door, desperately trying to secure horses.
Wow. Just wow.
It's a stark illustration of how far their power had eroded.
And inevitably, their identities were revealed.
Mm.
Marie Antoinette's plea for respect for the king in that moment of recognition. It was a final flash of royal dignity, I suppose.
It was. But the local officials were terrified, understandably, of the repercussions of assisting their escape.
Yeah, you can see why.
The ensuing hours of debate, the arrival of both revolutionary and royalist factions, it really underscores the fractured state of French society.
And there was that desperate suggestion for the king and the Dauphin to flee alone.
Yes, but Marie Antoinette fiercely refused. Prioritizing her son's safety, it really reveals her core as a mother, I think.
Mm-hmm. And ultimately, Louis VI's unwillingness to resort to violence sealed their fate.
It seems so. Their return to Paris was just a slow, agonizing procession, met by an increasingly hostile crowd. It feels like any semblance of order had completely broken down by then.
So back in the Tuileries, their imprisonment tightened.
Considerably.
Even then, Marie Antoinette continued to try and find some way for the monarchy to exist within the new political order.
She did. She kept trying. But the lack of any real support from her brother, Emperor Leopold of Austria, that speaks volumes, doesn't it?
Yeah, why was that?
Well, his concerns for Austria's own interests clearly outweighed his familial obligations. It highlights a crucial insight. Even family bonds can be secondary to political pragmatism,
Right, politics first. And from Marie Antoinette's perspective, inviting foreign intervention was a really dangerous gamble anyway.
Hugely dangerous. Any Austrian military action would just paint them as traitors in the eyes of the French people.
So they were trapped, their clandestine correspondence, using invisible ink. It just underscores their isolation and desperation.
Mm-hmm. And one source quotes Marie Antoinette's own bleak assessment of Louis VI's indecisiveness and her own limitations as queen. She understood that the public largely blamed her, the foreigner, for France's problems.
The scapegoat.
Pretty much. The fact that they had to take turns sleeping, fearing assassination,
Yeah.
it paints a terrifying picture of their existence.
Just awful. And then the storming of the Tuileries in August 1792 and the massacre of the Swiss Guards.
The terrifying escalation, yes. They're seeking refuge with the Legislative Assembly themselves. Revolutionaries proved futile.
Right.
And that led to their final confinement at Temple Prison. Even the simple act of referring to Louis XVI as Monsieur instead of Sire.
Right.
It was a symbolic stripping away of his remaining authority.
Such a small thing, but so significant. The king's trial for conspiring against liberty followed.
With remarkably vague charges.
Right. Despite his rather stoic defense, the outcome was pretty much predetermined.
Sadly, yes. The chilling detail of Marie Antoinette hearing the cannons announcing her husband's execution, that really brings home the personal devastation.
Unimaginable.
But the suffering wasn't over. The removal of their young son, Louis Charles.
Oh, the Dauphin.
Yes. And the calculated cruelty of his re-education. I mean, it was aimed at erasing his royal identity and forcing him to falsely accuse his own mother.
That's just unbearable to contemplate.
It speaks to the depths of inhumanity that political fervor can reach sometimes.
So, the trial of Marie Antoinette in October 1793. It was a complete sham, wasn't it?
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
Key evidence that might have supported her was destroyed. The accusations ranged from financial mismanagement to, frankly, ludicrous claims of treason, with no credible evidence presented for the more serious charges.
And her lawyer had hardly any time to prepare.
Exactly. It underscores the preordained verdict. Yet our sources highlight her sharp, dignified responses to the accusations, especially her powerful assertion that the French people had been deceived, but not by her or her husband.
And the forced testimony of her young son. How did she react to that?
Her cold, withering response about the malleability of a child of 8 in such circumstances.
Right.
It speaks volumes about the nightmare she was living.
God. But the prosecutor's vile smear campaign culminated in that horrific and baseless accusation of incest.
Just monstrous. And Marie Antoinette's immediate and visceral appeal to the mothers in the courtroom in response to this lie. It's a truly powerful moment of human dignity in the face of utter barbarity.
But she was found guilty.
She was, and her execution followed swiftly. Our sources describe her physical decline, the poignant final letter to Madame Elizabeth.
And that sketch by Jacques-Louis David.
Ah, yes. Depicting her in the open cart, such a stark contrast to her earlier portraits, it reveals not just a woman facing death, but one who had endured unimaginable suffering with a degree of fortitude.
Thomas Jefferson's later, rather simplistic assertion that the revolution wouldn't have happened without the Queen. Our sources rightly challenge that, don't they?
They do. It completely overlooks the deep-seated social and economic issues plaguing France.
Right. Well, Marie Antoinette certainly made missteps. To pin the entire revolution on her is just a gross oversimplification.
And tragically, her death didn't solve France's problems. It ushered in the even bloodier Reign of Terror.
Exactly. So while not technically the last queen, she undoubtedly had every reason to believe she was. It makes you consider how easily scapegoats are found during times of upheaval.
A truly devastating end. Okay, let's shift our focus now to the Ottoman Empire.
Right. Let's look at the final years of Sultan Abdulhamid II following the 31 March incident in 1909.
Okay.
Our sources detail his immediate exile to Salonika by train. This was a move against his express wish to remain in Istanbul, probably at Shirazan Palace.
Why Salonika?
It seems the Committee of Union and Progress, the CUP, wanted to ensure he was far removed from the center of power. They were strong there. This immediate and forceful removal really highlights the decisive nature of the political shift.
And the hurried nature of his departure is almost comical in a dark way. That lost suitcase. Oh yeah, the lost suitcase containing a fortune in cash, jewels, and stocks. Quite something.
So he was accompanied by a sizable retinue to the Villa Alatini in Salonika. Who were the Alatinis?
A wealthy and influential Jewish family there. Abdulhamid lived in their villa, but under guard, a stark contrast to his former imperial palaces.
Absolutely. Was he completely cut off?
Well, despite his deposition, he managed to maintain some level of communication, initially with figures in the Third Army.
Okay.
Our sources also mention his continued efforts to arrange marriages for his daughters.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a poignant reminder of his lingering paternal responsibilities amidst his own loss of power. But the issue of his considerable personal wealth quickly became a point of contention with the new government.
I can imagine. That focus on his wealth, even in exile, it underscores the enduring power of financial resources, doesn't it?
It does. The government actively tried to seize his European bank holdings. Abdulhamid, in response, put forward a series of demands. Things like the purchase of the villa for his use, financial support for his family and staff, a personal allowance, and guarantees for his safety.
To get them.
Ultimately, he was compelled to donate significant assets and agreed to the sale of his jewels for the Navy. The question of how he accumulated such vast wealth in the first place, well, that's certainly a topic for further exploration, as one of our sources suggests.
Right. It raises questions about the financial side of imperial power. So what was life like for him in Salonika?
Initially, it was quite Spartan. Basic amenities lacking, things like beds.
Really?
Yeah. Constant surveillance and a deliberate lack of information from the outside world contributed to his isolation.
So he was really locked down.
Pretty much. Our sources mention his pastimes reading novels and woodworking as ways to fill the long hours of confinement. There was even a reported assassination attempt.
Wow.
A stark reminder of the ongoing threats he faced.
And we have an account from his personal physician.
Yes, a tough Hussein Bey. It provides a fascinating and intimate glimpse into Abdulhamid's 9 years in exile. Apparently, Atif Bey initially held a negative view of the former sultan, but his opinion evolved over time.
Interesting. What kind of details did he record?
His notes reveal Abdulhamid's daily routines, his surprising habits, like taking cold showers.
Cold showers.
Yep. His attire, his intellectual interests, and his perceived fears and even paranoia. It's fascinating to see the human being behind the imperial facade.
Absolutely. Any other quirks?
Well, we learn about his fear of mice, but not snakes, and the rather unusual detail of him pulling his own teeth despite a fear of needles.
Pulling his own teeth. Ouch!
Right. Atif Bey also documented Abdulhamid's handwritten petition appealing the accusations against him and requesting it be read in Parliament.
Did that happen?
No, the request was ultimately denied. Despite assurances of his safety in Salonika, the shifting political landscape of the Balkans would soon necessitate another move. But that petition, Though unsuccessful, it shows his continued attempt to engage with the political process, even from exile.
So what prompted the move back to Istanbul?
The outbreak of the Balkan Wars created a new set of circumstances. It just wasn't safe for him there anymore. So the decision was made to relocate Abdulhamid back to Istanbul.
And they chose Beylerbeyi Palace.
Yes. It's interesting that fear, which seems to have been a constant companion in his later years, made him initially reluctant to return.
You can understand that, given everything.
Definitely. But the urgency of the situation, with the Greek army advancing on Salonika, ultimately compelled the move. They even took the rather extraordinary measure of requesting German naval assistance, the SMS Lorelei, to ensure safe passage because the Greek Navy was in the area.
That's incredible.
It really underscores the precariousness of the whole thing. He arrived at Beylerbeyi Palace in November 1912, just days before Salonika fell to the Greeks. It was almost as if the tides of history were just carrying him along.
So life in Beylerbeyi, was it better than Salonika?
Relatively speaking, yes. While still under supervision, it offered an improvement over the strict isolation of Salonika. He had access to newspapers, was allowed visitors.
Okay.
Sultan Mehmed Rishad, his successor, reportedly made efforts to ensure his well-being. Our sources detail Abdulhamid's daily habits, his heavy coffee and cigarette consumption. And there are conflicting accounts regarding alcohol use.
Always conflicting accounts. How did he die?
Well, his final illness was attended by leading physicians. The consultation report listed a rather unusual cause of death, apparently excessive eating the night before, which contrasts with the official cause given, which was heart failure. Abdulhamid II died in February 1918 at the age of 77, after a long reign and those years of exile.
And the CUP, who deposed him, organized his funeral.
Yes, despite their past opposition, he was buried with the respect due to a former ruler. There's a particularly poignant anecdote of people in the funeral procession lamenting the economic difficulties they had faced since his reign. It suggests a complex and evolving public memory.
That's really interesting. The shifting perception of Abdulhamid, from deposed sultan to eventually a figure of historical significance in the Republican era, it's quite striking.
It is. It speaks to how historical narratives can be reshaped over time.
And finally, our sources touch on the perspective of Arab Ottoman imperialists.
Yes, individuals from Arabic-speaking regions who served in Abdulhamid's administration and maintained a strong loyalty to the empire. The Azmazad family is highlighted as an example.
Okay.
These individuals, initially holding positions of power, found themselves marginalized after Abdulhamid's deposition and the empire's subsequent collapse. This really underscores the profound socio-political transformations of the Hamidian period and the rise of, well, nationalist sentiments and ethno-racial differentiation.
Right. So as we conclude this deep dive, we see these compelling, if divergent, paths. Both Marie Antoinette and Sultan Abdulhamid II, figures of immense power, were ultimately swept away by the forces of revolution and significant political change.
Both experienced the loss of their positions, a form of exile, and both ultimately met their end.
But the contrasts are just as telling, aren't they?
Absolutely. Marie Antoinette actively fought, it seems, to regain influence, while Abdulhamid's resistance in exile seems more subdued, more passive, perhaps.
Yeah. And her final moments played out in a brutal public spectacle, whereas Abdulhamid's deposition and later life, while certainly difficult, were much more controlled, maybe.
More controlled, less public, certainly.
It really prompts you to consider, what does the fate of these two very different rulers tell us about the nature of power itself? How fragile can even the most absolute authority be in the face of societal upheaval?
And what endures beyond the loss of power in life?
Exactly. It encourages us to look beyond the grand narratives of royalty and revolution and to contemplate the individual human experience within these monumental historical shifts.
Well put. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.